is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Between the 11th and 12th of August 2017, a white supremacist rally was scheduled to take place in Charlottesville, Virginia. It was called the Unite the Right Rally, organized by a neo-Nazi named Jason Kessler to protest Confederate monuments being removed by the government, which Kessler called an effort to attack white history. The rally's attendees varied: neo-Nazis, far-right militia, die-hard white supremacists, the alt-right, and members of the Ku Klux Klan. Not to mention the former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, David Duke.
The camera's right here. What does today represent to you?
How you doing? This represents a turning point for the people of this country. We are determined to take our country back. We're going to fulfill the promises of Donald Trump. That's what we believed in. That's why we voted for Donald Trump, because he said he's going to take our country back, and that's what we got to do.
Local residents were concerned about what the rally would mean for their community. Just over a month before, another rally had been held in Charlottesville by members of the KKK. Groups of local people joined forces with activists who were planning to protest against Unite the Right, and a counter-protest was organized. The counter-protest united people from across different backgrounds, political alignments, religions, and beliefs. And when the Unite the Right rally was about to begin, the protesters gathered to stand up for what they felt was right. The rally was everything that the Charlottesville community feared. People showed up waving Confederate battle flags and banners painted with swastikas and other Nazi symbols. They joined together to yell racist chants, waving their weapons and aggressively confronting counter-protesters. On the 12th of August, just before 2 p.m., a group of counter-protesters were struck by a car driving 28 miles per hour. The Dodge Challenger mowed down several pedestrians and then crashed into a sedan, which crashed into a minivan, which crashed into even more people. Witnesses at the scene said that pedestrians were thrown into the air by the force of the impact. It was chaos, but the driver of the Dodge was not done. The car only paused for a few seconds before reversing into even more counter-protesters. The man behind the wheel of the Dodge reversed away from the crime scene for a couple of blocks, then turned and attempted to make a getaway. The car was seriously damaged, causing its bumper to drag along the ground, and it was covered with blood, as well as pieces of the people he had run over. A police helicopter, which had watched the whole attack from above, documented the driver's escape to police units on the ground. A deputy caught up with the Dodge only a mile away from the protest and called for backup. Detective Stephen Young arrived at the scene and apprehended the driver, a 20-year-old man named James Alex Fields, Jr. James Fields had been a troubled teenager. According to one of his teachers in high school, James suffered from severe outbursts of anger and had been diagnosed with schizophrenia at a young age. As an adult, he needed treatment for a range of other mental disorders: ADHD, depression, and bipolar disorder. James was raised by a single mother, and she was the one who suffered the most during his fits of rage. When he was 13 years old, he scared her so much that she locked herself in the bathroom, convinced that her own son was going to kill her. In a call to the police, she said that she'd told James that he needed to take a break from playing video games. In response, James hit her, covered her mouth, and had taken away her phone. Derek Weimer, the same high school teacher who knew about James's schizophrenia diagnosis, remembered one other thing about the boy. He had a strange, deep love for Adolf Hitler. His classmates remembered James doodling swastikas on his school books while he was still in middle school, and as James got older, he only became more and more fascinated with Hitler's ideologies. While James's classmates and teachers were often disturbed by his behavior and his doodles, they mostly thought that he was just an odd boy who was a bit of a social outcast at school. Nobody ever officially reported James for his behavior, so even though he had a bit of a reputation for being an extremist, The school officials were never made aware. A spokesperson for Boone County Schools later criticized James' classmates, saying that if the stories that they're telling now had any truth to them, they should have made an official report at the time. Quote, "This is something I'm guilty of too," said one of James Field's ex-classmates. "I kind of brushed it off as just creepy. We thought it was all talk. No one ever thought he would do something so violent." Mr. Weimer said, quote, "Once you talked to James for a while, you would start to see that sympathy toward Nazism, that idolization of Hitler, that belief in white supremacy, it would start to creep out." End quote. He was concerned about James's interest in these things, but he also liked the kid, who he thought was a student with a bright future. Mr. Weimer had attempted to discourage James' interest in Hitler, and for a while he thought he'd succeeded, until the day that James decided to drive a Dodge Challenger through a crowd of people. When he was apprehended by the police, James's response surprised Detective Young. Instead of behaving aggressively, he was incredibly apologetic and repeatedly asked if anybody had been hurt in the attack. The truth is that 35 people had been wounded, and one woman, 32-year-old named Heather Heyer, had died from her injuries shortly afterwards. Heather was a passionate advocate for equal rights, and she and her friends had initially agreed not to attend the protest, thinking that it was too dangerous. But the night before, Heather had decided that she needed to stand up for what she believed in, even if it was dangerous. When Detective Young told James about Heather's death, he immediately burst into tears. 2 days after the attack, Donald Trump gave a statement where he praised Heather Heyer, calling her an incredible young woman. The next day, he gave a follow-up statement, but this one was not well received.
You're putting what you're calling the alt-left and white supremacists on the same moral plane.
I'm not putting anybody on a moral plane. What I'm saying is this. You had a group on one side and you had a group on the other, and they came at each other with clubs, and it was vicious, and it was horrible, and it was a horrible thing to watch. But there is another side. There was a group on this side, you can call them the left, or you've just called them the left, that came violently attacking the other group. So you can say what you want, but that's the way it is. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. And you had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name. So I only tell you this, there are two sides to a story. I thought what took place was a horrible moment for our country, a horrible moment. But there are two sides to the country. Does anybody
Jason Kessler, the man who had organized the rally, stated that he wasn't affiliated with James Fields Jr. in any way. In fact, he said that he didn't even know who he was. However, less than a week after Heather died, Kessler posted a tweet where he called her, quote, "a fat, disgusting communist," adding, "Communists have killed 94 million. Looks like it was payback time." After a huge amount of backlash, he deleted the tweet, claiming that his Twitter account had been hacked. Later, he went back on his statement, saying that he'd actually posted the tweet while he'd been under the influence of drugs. From the beginning of the investigation, the Department of Justice announced that the case would be charged as a federal hate crime. The director of the FBI stated that the attack met the definition of domestic terrorism. To discourage any similar attacks in the future, they needed to make an example out of James, no matter how remorseful and apologetic he had been when he was arrested. In June 2018, James faced charges for several counts of 3 different federal hate crimes. 1 count of racially motivated violent interference with a federally protected activity, 1 count of a hate crime resulting in death, and 28 counts of a hate crime causing bodily injury and involving an attempt to kill. At his federal trial, he pleaded not guilty to all charges against him, but later he changed to a guilty plea, hoping to avoid the death penalty. Instead of execution, he received a life sentence. James also faced state charges for malicious wounding, a hit and run, and second-degree murder. Later, the charges were changed to include first-degree murder and felonious assault. After a 3-week-long trial in 2018, James was found guilty. He was handed a second life sentence for Heather Heyer's murder, as well as 419 additional years in prison for the other crimes he committed. Even after James was convicted, white supremacist media continued to push the agenda that Heather Heyer hadn't actually died due to James running her over. Instead, they said that she passed away because of a heart attack due to her weight. This was the most popular conspiracy theory surrounding the attack, but it wasn't the only one. There were also rumors that James had been acting in self-defense after a protester threatened to shoot him, and that a different man had actually been behind the wheel of the car. Heather's father insisted that he'd forgiven James and urged other people to do the same. Quote, "My thoughts with all of this stuff are that people need to stop hating, and they need to forgive each other." He said, "I include myself in that, forgiving the guy that did this. He doesn't know better. I just think about what the Lord said on the cross. Lord, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. If you're brand new to listening to 10-Minute Murder, welcome to the podcast. Hope you enjoy it, and please subscribe now so that you can more easily catch up on all the back episodes and connect on social media. See the pictures of what we talk about here in the podcast. It's not gross and graphic stuff, and especially not with what we're talking about today. I will probably post links to some of the news stories surrounding the Charlottesville car attack. However, it's not going to be gruesome crime scene stuff. I've mentioned this before. I don't like seeing that, and I assume that you don't either. And if you do, you're more than welcome to find that stuff on your own. I can't control that, so you do you. I'm just not going to post that on the 10-Minute Murder social media pages. Hey, and if you like this episode, please leave a rating and review on Apple, Spotify, Audible, any place that's possible. Your positive feedback, believe it or not, it helps this show grow. It helps more and more people find 10-Minute Murder, and it helps the show grow. And maybe the biggest thing that helps is sharing this podcast with your friends and family. And quickly, an email from one of you listening. This is from Ellie in Atlanta. Hey, Joe, long time, first time. Let me ask you something. If you didn't do a podcast about true crime, what else would you do a podcast about? Also, are you as cute as you sound? And that's, again, Ellie in Atlanta. Let me address that last thing first, Ellie. Yes, obviously I am. My mom says I'm handsome, so that should clear it up. Unless you're calling my mom a liar. And then we've got beef. Okay, so if I wasn't doing a podcast about true crime, I'd probably do one interviewing stand-up comedians. I love stand-up comedy, and it's what I use to kind of get my brain in a different place after I finish researching and doing episodes for this podcast. I listen to stand-up comedy, or I watch stand-up comedy. Their lives are really interesting, and I think that would make an interesting podcast. Or maybe, since my work away from this podcast involves directing and producing video content, I could do a podcast about something related to that. But like many of you listening, I love my job, but when I come home from work, I want to leave work at work as much as possible. Again, thank you, Ellie, for the email. And if you want to get in touch, joe@10minutemurder.com is my email address. All right, that's going to do it. That's your episode for today. Thank you so much for listening to 10-Minute Murder.